Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar from the American Journal of International Law, focusing on the international regulation of women in sports. My name is Jen Malat from Cambridge University Press, and before we get started, I'd like to go over a few quick housekeeping items. You've all joined in listen-only mode. Please submit any questions via the Q&A box, and the panelists will review them if there is time. In the unlikely event we experience any major technical issues, we will restart the webinar. The whole event will take about 1 hour. To get everything started, I'll turn things over to Monica Hakimi, one of the editors-in-chief of AJIl, who will introduce the panelists.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to the webinar. Thanks, Jen, and thanks to all of you for being here. I'm Monica Hakimi, one of the editors-in-chief of the American Journal of International Law, as Jen mentioned, and with Ingrid Bronk as my co-editor-in-chief. And our conversation today is inspired in part by an article which we just published in the January 2025 issue of the Journal by Michele Krech, entitled Gender Equality in World Athletics, Transnational Norm Development by Private International Organizations. And Michele is here with us today, so let me start by introducing her, as well as our other panelists, Lena Holzer. So Michele is now a Harry A. Bigelow Teaching Fellow at the University of Chicago Law School, and her research interests are at the intersection of international and transnational law. We were just discussing how this piece is interesting not only for the way in which it discusses women in sports in particular, but also the broader phenomenon of private actors participating in international legal regulation. And we are joined by, as I mentioned, Lena Holzer, who is an assistant professor in gender, race, and the law in the law faculty at the University of Cambridge, and the Sheila Leslie Fellow at Girton College. Her research focuses on human rights and sports law, and she uses critical feminist, queer, and intersectional approaches to analyzing these areas of law. Finally, I'll just mention that we intended to have a third panelist, Andrea Carska-Sheppard, who's a practicing lawyer, sports arbitrator, and global corporate counsel, and specializes in commercial and sports law. So she was on our advertising material. She hasn't shown up yet. I'm not sure if she's had some emergency to stop her from coming, but I'm hoping that she will show up in the middle of the session. And if she does, we'll of course welcome her as well. So with that to start, the conversation today is about the international regulation of women in sports. And this is a topic that is, it seems, always in some sense current, but especially current now. And before we talk about sort of current developments in the area, Michele, since your piece has a sort of historical valence to it, I thought we would start by just asking you to tell us a little bit about the piece and the argument you make in it.
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, part of the impetus behind this article is sort of, as you say, the fact that sport offers a paradigmatic example of law and governance beyond the state and beyond the interstate or classically international. It fits more in the category of transnational or global law because it's regulated worldwide primarily by private organizations. So this article is focusing on one particular private sports body that has relatively recently proclaimed itself a leader when it comes to supporting women and advancing gender equality in sport. It's also an organization that, like most other international sport governing bodies, originated as an exclusively male enterprise. So it's transformed significantly over the course of 110 years in this case. And so I wondered maybe what role law had played in this transformation, because of course, over the last century, gender equality and non-discrimination have been gradually enshrined in law, both domestically and internationally. As it turns out, however, it's relatively rare that World Athletics has been directly confronted with the law. Like all international sport governing bodies, it operates largely outside the jurisdiction of any particular state-based legal regime. It sort of makes its own rules. It's not directly subject to control by domestic or international courts. But there have been a few times where the law, and particularly the legal norm of gender equality, has been invoked to challenge World Athletics and its regulatory practices. So I review a few sort of in historical context, 3 examples of that, one in the 1980s, then the 1990s, and then starting in the 2010s, 3 sort of types of regulations that have been challenged and different sources of law that have been invoked to challenge those regulations. And what the historical account in the article reveals is that in the face of these legal challenges, World Athletics has effectively retrofitted, as I put it, gender equality to align with its pre-existing, long-standing regulatory practices. So, in other words, regulatory practices originally designed to sort of exclude or restrain women's participation become rebranded as actually in furtherance of gender equality. So, as much as we might think that evolving legal norms might transform private regulatory practices, the reverse is also true. In defending private regulatory practices, organizations like World Athletics shape the meaning of the legal norms, like gender equality, that are invoked against them. So this is kind of a way to consolidate its private authority. I can, of course, detail this process further, but the key point here is that sort of what results are kind of limited understandings of gender equality. So certain meanings or understandings or interpretations are reinforced, while others are filtered out in this process. So private sports organizations are playing a role in what gender equality means around the world.
Great, thank you. And Andrea, I see you just joined us. Welcome. It's so nice to see you. I introduced you a little bit earlier, but it's nice to have you, and I'm glad you were able to make it. And thank you, Michele, for that introduction to your piece. Let me ask you, I was wondering one follow-up question as I was rereading it today, which is, one of, I think, the central claims in the paper is about how, as you say, World Athletics like sort of retrofits pre-existing norms to respond to challenges to the way it's exercising its authority. And the piece has sort of like a critical I would almost call it like a critical intuition that is never quite, it's not quite entirely critical, but I would say like it's informed by critical intuitions. And I guess I was just wondering if you could explain a little bit more that intuition. One might say in response, and I'm just curious how you would reply to this, that this process of norm creation and development and application is sort of part of how people generally interact with law of all kinds, including, that which goes by formal law. And that although one might look at it as a sort of a retrofit and a post hoc justification for practices that are on the ground, one might also look at it as a transformation of like pre-existing understandings of a norm in response to claims that those understandings were no longer, fit for purpose or suitable for a more contemporary environment or modern sensibilities. And then in fact, what was happening here was that World Athletics was transforming itself in response to the claims against it. And while at the same time changing its practices on the ground. And so that's I guess that's a more like affirming vision, but it's not the one you really take. And so why is it that you don't take that more affirming vision? Why is it that you view World Athletics as more of a sort of black box cloister that's like really sort of resistant to the challenges that are brought against it in the service of gender equality?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's certainly the case that World Athletics, as I mentioned up top, has transformed significantly. So the argument is not that this organization has just steadfastly remained the same since the beginning. There has been gradual transformation, and I focused, I guess, on a couple aspects or that I think are interesting and how I might respond to that. So one is like, what is the impetus for change is less a normative commitment to a certain understanding of gender equality, whatever that may be. It's more a response to threats or opportunities to, different dimensions of the organization's authority. So what the organization is responding to is not directly to a normative development in the law, but more to how it's threatening its ability to govern everyone worldwide and to be the only governor in that space and to not be subject to oversight by any other entity, courts or otherwise. And I suppose, and another piece is to sort of highlight that this is the relationship between law and these private regulatory systems that sort of influence moves in both directions. So I think we more typically think, oh, the law is probably going to affect how these organizations regulate and that's true. So I'm not denying that is part of the story, but sort of the, I think, unaccounted part of the story is that it also works in the opposite direction, that the understanding of the law is shaped by every time actually that this private organization is sort of confronted with the law and engages with the law, it ends up shaping the meaning of the law applied to it. And then I guess the final piece that contributes to, I guess, the kind of critical perspective that I think you rightly sense in the piece has to do with the actual structure, which we can talk more about, of sport governance in general and of World Athletics in particular, as a private organization that is, I mean, I don't think anyone would argue with the fact that it's, you know, not transparent, that it's not a particularly participatory or democratic institution, that power is quite centralized. So the avenues to change are quite specific because of that. And again, in ways we could talk about further, but you don't have, the private governance structure really affects the pathways to change. And I sort of try to highlight what the limits of those pathways in this piece, as we can see over time. One thing that hasn't changed a lot actually is sort of the big picture structure of sport governance, as well as the internal structure of these organizations, has been quite consistent over 100 years. And it's a very centralized form of decision making.
Okay, great. Well, thank you for that overview of the piece and that response. So Lena, maybe I could come to you, because one of the things that Michele just mentioned was the sort of limits on the accountability of World Athletics. And so my question for you then would be, to what extent do you think public international law is, as formally understood, is an adequate or might be used as a more adequate mechanism for holding World Athletics accountable, or for participating in the regulation of sport, and particularly for advancing women's equality in this space?
Yeah, thank you so much. So first, I just wanted to also thank the organizers for organizing this. And I wanted to say that I really admire the work of Michele and Andrea, who both kind of contribute a lot to kind of promoting, ensuring gender equality in sports. So regarding public international law, I think what becomes really visible these days, and what is also visible in Michele's article, is that sports is not kind of a self-contained system which does not interrelate with other systems. Lex sportiva, which is sometimes called, it's an interplay of different norms from different normative orders, including domestic law, something like transnational law, as well as also public international law. And I think one avenue which public international law provides in order to think about the actions and the rules of sports federations is human rights law. So we have many international treaties, and I think recently there's really a move also to consider sports from the angle of human rights, as well as also from labor law. So athletes for a long time have not been kind of considered as workers, but now we have stronger kind of athletes unions who really point out the fact that athletes have labor rights, and they also have human rights. Otherwise, the whole concept of human rights wouldn't make sense as such. So I think one thing we could explore is like how can we then use the mechanisms which exist in public international law, for example, in human rights, to make them effective for athletes. And there are several challenges related to that. And one of the challenges really to find which state kind of has jurisdiction to deal over actions by sport federations, because we have this like several states involved. We have those states where the sport federations are registered, which is very often Switzerland, but also other states. But Switzerland has a strong role because there are many sports federations registered in Switzerland as non-governmental organizations. But then we have also the states which are hosting tournaments, mega sporting events, and then we have also states where then the arbitration tribunal is seated, and all of these states somehow have a role to play. And then so if one wants to bring a case against a state, one has to kind of first decide which state is responsible for also protecting human rights, so which state has due diligence obligations. And then I think I would really find it interesting to see cases at human rights treaty bodies. So using, for example, individual communications procedures, which human rights treaty bodies offer, or also just to raise sports as an issue in the reporting procedures, the interactive dialogues with human rights treaty bodies. So I think this hasn't been really done, and I think it's something which lawyers like us should think about, as well as like activists, of how to use the already existing mechanisms. Yeah.
And just to follow up with you then, that all makes sense. You know, it's just striking listening to the two of you speak about the phenomenon. One of the things people often say about international law is that it is a relatively weak legal system. And it sounds as if, I mean, is this the case in your view, Lena? It sounds as if that this form of, like, let's call it private public international law is not a particularly weak legal system, and B, the reason it's not particularly weak is that it is centralized in the way that authority is centralized in the way that Michele mentions, and in a way that a lot of public international law is thought not to be centralized. Or C, is it weak or not weak because it is not subject to the same accountability mechanisms through human rights and domestic legal processes, international and domestic legal processes that might hold the various participants accountable. So when you think about the regulation of sport relative to the regulation of other transnational activities, and particularly relative to the regulation of other transnational activities that are more properly thought of as being governed by public international law, is this mode of regulation more powerful, less powerful, differently powerful? Like, how do you see that?
So I think one kind of core element of, let's say, the access to justice mechanisms which exist in sports governments is arbitration. So it's like private arbitration tribunals, and the reason for that is that, like, sport federations use usually arbitration clauses in their agreements with the athletes, as well as also with hosting states. And that means that then access to domestic courts is usually excluded. So the only way how to kind of dispute how to settle disputes is through arbitration tribunals. And the core mechanism here is the Court of Arbitration for Sports, which most sport federations use, but not all of them. And the CAS is seated in Switzerland. And now we see this is, I think one of the reasons why the system is relatively weak for athletes themselves to gain justice is because of this arbitration system, where I think equality of arms is not really granted, also because sport federations have more resources most of the time than athletes themselves. It depends. And here we really see kind of also intersectionality playing out. So whether athletes can actually go in front of the CAS and can have like an effective justice mechanism is also dependent on the resources they have in terms of paying lawyers. And that really varies also depending on the geographical region where one comes from. But at the moment, just to mention, there's also the case of Carska-Sheppard pending at the Grand Chamber of the European Court of Human Rights, which shows that even if athletes use the CAS as the dispute settlement mechanisms, there is a way to bring the case to the European Court of Human Rights after all, because one can kind of appeal the decision at the Swiss Federal Tribunal. The Swiss Federal Tribunal acts as kind of like a review mechanisms to CAS awards, and then in instances which concern human rights, which fall under the European Convention of Human Rights, one could then also bring a claim against Switzerland in front of the European Court of Human Rights. So to a certain extent, it's a very closed system because of the arbitration system, but at the same time, there are some mechanisms which one can use to bring a case to a kind of a human rights court.
Okay, great. And Andrea, I think that's a nice transition then to you to ask, you're very much working from within the system, you've seen it operate on the ground, I think, quite closely. And so maybe you could tell us a little bit about how you see these accountability mechanisms operating and what paths for change you've seen or been able to exercise, particularly, I understand, in the protection of women's health and safety and equal participation in sports.
Thank you very much. I hope you hear me well. I am in Lisbon, so saying hello to everyone. I landed today, so sorry for a little bit of technical hiccup. It's a really pleasure to be with these esteemed colleagues, academics, for me, practitioner on the panel. I was nominated to come here by Women's Sports International, which is a prominent global organization for research on women. Many pioneers in this area are members of that organization and on the board. So I had to catch up a little bit on sources of law and international law because I'm a corporate and sports lawyer and arbitrator. And as a general counsel of global company, I oversee 200 countries and territories and 23 subsidiaries. So I am more practitioner, so I didn't want to be behind everyone. And I cannot agree more than what Lena said. I have looked into the issue of how to best internationally approach these areas for equality, and it came to me to sport and human rights. And I was trying to catch up also on sources of law. And actually, CAS has produced very good overview of sports and human rights. It's on their website from November 2023. And they are citing different regulations, conventions, laws, everything we have available as a tools, as a lawyers, to enhance our issues and promote. I also noted that we have a convention on elimination of all forms of discrimination against women, which is 20 years old. But with all that being said, there was changes take a long time. Changes take also legally or also on the ground take a long time. And I just happen to be lucky that I have been on the kind of like on the emerging trends, at the beginning of several emerging trends in sports and law. I cannot talk about all three of them. One of them was being one of the first sports journalists covering AJIl for Montreal Canadiens. That was in 90s experience. I can talk about hours, but what you asked about, Monica, about health and safety, it came up just by kind of coincidence. I was at the right place at the right time, and I have dipped into the problematic of safe sport very early. It was in 2011-12. I have met pioneers like Celia Brackenridge, Carrie Fasting, others, Margot Monjoy, and others who were working as a social scientist in this area. And I was actually one of the first lawyers to be in the working group of prevention of harassment and abuse in sports. And I can tell you at that time, it was a social and medical issue. It wasn't so much a legal. We had to get where we are. And there was a lot of critique from some people. Oh, it's not sophisticated legally yet what we have, but we had to start from the scratch because for women's safety and health, where even today 21% of professional women athletes experience sex and abuse as a children. So even back before Me Too, it was even worse. And we had to kind of operate very kind of diplomatically because many sports organizations, they didn't have safeguarding prevention of harassment and abuse in sports on their radar. Actually, I would say it was very deeply under their radar. So we had to kind of develop the structure, and there was, I would say, 3 phases where we had to work with guidelines, slowly produce the toolkit, which opened kind of a horizon in this area. Then we saw after Me Too, things have started to pick up, and we have seen safeguarding officers being present at the Olympics. We had one safeguarding in Rio, and now we had 115 in Paris. So, but just to tell you, at Safe Sports Conference in 2018, I was the only lawyer speaker at that time. Now we go and we see lots of lawyers, and I'm so excited. I'm so excited to see this interest and all these guidelines and International Sports Federation working in this area. Because lawyers want to help, but it's human rights, but it's also corporate issues. The organization's settlement for US gymnastics was $380 million. So we are seeing a big momentum in safeguarding last few years, but and we are having a full recognition now by lawyers, for example, at CAS conference in Geneva. there were victors or victims, as we call them, speaking to the lawyers, and that was my most kind of favorite moment. But with all that, what is being done, what my issue is, and what I am seeing, we have a law, we have guidelines, we have. It's not perfect; it could be better, but we have sources we can work with. Unfortunately, right now, I'm seeing a very rough application on the ground of this safe sport. Still, it requires a nuance. It's well intended, but it's still very rough what we are saying. Also, sensitivity to minors is still not where we want to have it. We have a Child's Convention, UN Convention on Rights of Child. I have arbitrated a case where there were two minors. There was a cyberbullying case between two minors, and unfortunately, I was, as a corporate lawyer, I thought this could be settled in a few minutes, and unfortunately, the case escalated, and parents actually got involved more than minors. They had their egos vested, and there was the proceedings went to the hearing and everything. So that's just lots of issues on the side of minors, on the side of impartial hearings and so on. So I can go on for very long, but I don't want to take all the time.
Thank you, but maybe I might ask you just one follow-up question, which is, we were talking earlier about how the sports, world athletics and the regulation of sports is it's in certain ways a closed system. But when you're talking, when I hear you speak, I hear you saying, although it is sort of like a formally closed system, particularly if what you want is to hold accountable those who have acted wrongfully, because you'll be shunted off to arbitration, for example. There are also opportunities for like social movements within the system to, as you say, bring in more lawyers to focus attention on the problems that many athletes face. And so how do you think about like the role that lawyers play within this system, given that they are not as able to tap into sort of like formal judicial proceedings in the way that I think many would think might be more effective?
Lawyers have a critical role, and not only people who are calling themselves sports lawyers. I'm seeing, for example, even many employment lawyers, like we have 20% of people like on the workplaces around the world are experiencing harassment and abuse, for example. So lawyers have to really take leadership roles, and it's not easy to do it. Because our voices usually it's very hard to find the proper forum where to present our views. It has to be very motivated individuals as lawyers to kind of push the agenda forward. There are lots of political considerations. So, but I see the future very good. I've seen, for example, in media, sports and media, I have seen lots of improvement. For example, portrayal guidelines in different television stations are improving their broadcasting. So there are different aspects where we as lawyers, we can come on from human rights perspective, we can come from the media perspective, we can come from safe sport, all kinds of angles. And I think everyone has to find their mission, kind of what fits them best. And it's good to be focused and concentrated. And for me, once I achieve something, then I move to something else. Like I believe that now there are so many people dedicated to safeguarding. So I'm already looking on leadership. And for example, I'm very concerned about lack of still a representation of women in leadership positions. Pay equity, I just cannot reconcile. How could that be? Then Billie Jean King in 73 or 74 made a change, and here we are like 40 years later, and so many smart lawyers. So Monica, I think there is a lot of work to kind of legislate. For example, for pay equity, we have seen improvement for equal pay for Team USA Act. So maybe what USA is doing for their global athletes, other countries around the world should also be committed. And so there is a lot of legal arguments, but there is also a lot of kind of like using the patterns and advocacy by the lawyers. So we can have a full hands 24 hours a day.
Okay, great, thank you. And so Lena, that's a good opportunity maybe to circle back to you to ask the question of, the more recent attention to women in sports. I think it's fair to say, and I think Andrea confirms that in the past decade, we've seen much more attention to questions relating to international sports law generally, but in particular, the participation of women in sports. And so what do you think explains this sort of like increased interest and attention to the issue? Given that, as Michele's research shows and as Andrea's personal experience also confirms, these are issues that have been longstanding and that women have been fighting for in various ways for at least decades.
Yeah, I mean, I think some of the things which explain why there's more attention to gender equality and women's experiences in sports now have already been mentioned. For example, Michele mentioned that actually sport federations also kind of derive some legitimacy by kind of addressing the issue and maybe also reinforce their autonomy by dealing with gender equality and making it kind of an issue to talk about. But I also think that there might be some other reasons as well. So I think on the one hand, there's a bit of like an idea that there's untapped potential as well in women athletes and women accessing sports. So I think there are more and more investors also recognizing that there are a lot of great athletes out there who haven't received the attention they should. So I think that's one way to think about. Another reason I think why there's more focus on women and gender equality in sports is definitely also because human rights are more prevalently discussed in the field of sports. And then I think one maybe not so nice reason is because of several scandals which have happened in kind of the last, I think, 10, 15 years and which have really also drawn attention to generally, I think, lack of access to justice in sports and also lack of gender equality in sports. So for example, scandals in relation to sexual abuse and in, for example, the US gymnastics team in relation to the main doctor, or also the very recent, I think, scandal of the Hermoso case who has been kissed involuntarily live on TV. So I think some of these scandals have really drawn attention to the fact and to the experiences women face in sports. And I think one other reason why more attention has been paid is this question on gender eligibility rules. So how do we define gender and sex for sporting purposes, which has actually drawn also attention to actors who are usually not working from a quite feminist perspective. So I think it has kind of stirred up a very public debate, and I think that's why also to a certain extent gender has been more and more into the media as well.
Okay, that's a great transition actually to the next like sort of bucket of issues that I thought we might address, which is the trend toward regulating who counts as being sufficiently female to participate in women's sports. And so, Michele, I'll come back to you. Maybe you could just tell us first, just as a descriptive matter, what it is the US President Trump's executive order entitled, quote, "Keeping Men Out of Women's Sports," what that executive order does, as well as what its potential international significance might be, and how it relates to sort of broader trends in trying to define the boundaries between male and female athletes.
Yeah, it's a very fascinating executive order, both because it both sort of sets a domestic policy agenda in quite vague terms, but basically saying that the policy of the United States will be that everything, including sport in this situation, will be divided based on biological sex, binary biological sex, which essentially meaning that trans women cannot participate in women's teams. Unclear about what that means for intersex athletes or trans men or other, gender diverse athletes. It's a very vague policy in a sense, very simplistic. It doesn't go into detail. But what's beyond the sort of domestic measures, like including rescinding all funding from educational programs that would not follow this binary sex organization policy, the executive order also states that it will be the policy of the United States to oppose male competitive participation in women's sports more broadly. And specifically, it says that the US is going to promote, including at the United Nations, international rules and norms governing sports competition to protect what it calls a sex-based female sports category. And to this end, to sort of convene international governing bodies and others to promote the adoption of this rule. So the US is saying, we have a policy here, and also we're going to promote this worldwide and try to get international sport governing bodies to do what, to follow our policy. Another piece of it is adjusting immigration policies and other policies that would to sort of not permit admission to the United States, what they describe as males seeking to participate in women's sports. So that brings up many questions about the fact that, the US is meant to host the next Olympic Games. They host all kinds of international competitions. So it's sort of creating the potential for, clashes between US law and policy and the rules of various international sport governing bodies, also potentially between the laws of different states. Maybe even potentially violating international agreements, although that may not be a concern of the US government. The executive order also says it's specifically going to adopt measures to get the International Olympic Committee to, align with the US, sort of official US view on this issue as well. So it's actually, this executive order is kind of recognizing that domestic policy would not be enough because sport is regulated internationally. So we need to sort of get private international regulators on side with our policy if we want it to actually be effective.
And what is the current, just to put the policy in current context, what is the current policy of World Athletics, for example, on the question of transgender athletes participating in women's sports? Is there a specific policy, or is there ambiguity on this? And is the United States trying to clarify an ambiguity? So is it trying to change a policy? Yes, but is it trying to overturn that which exists? Is it trying to clarify an ambiguity? Is it trying, so how does it fit within what's already being regulated?
Yeah, so importantly, every international sports federation, so there's an international federation for every sport, essentially gets to set its own rules, including rules for female eligibility. World Athletics probably has the most detailed and explicit rules in this regard, but its rules apply only to the sport of track and field. So, FIFA gets to have its own rules that apply to soccer and so on. So World Athletics has quite strict rules, 2 sets of regulations, one governing trans athletes, one governing intersex athletes. And actually, just in the past week, I guess they've announced that they're actually going to make these rules even more restrictive and essentially align them so that really trans women who will be completely excluded. Likewise with intersex athletes with certain listed conditions that are deemed sort of equivalent to being a trans athlete, biologically speaking. So historically, over the last couple of decades, there's been 2 separate sets of regulations, one for intersex athletes, one for trans athletes. World Athletics is now kind of merging towards just excluding all these athletes altogether. That has not been adopted, but that's certainly the direction it's heading. So it's actually aligned, it seems like, with the US policy. We just have not used, what's different here is that we usually don't see states coming out with their own policy position on this issue. We actually typically see the opposite, where states say we defer to the international sports governing bodies to decide, which has its own issues. But this is probably the first time where there's a state has said, this is the policy, and we're going to try to convince the international sports federations to follow us.
And Andrea, thanks, Michele. And so Andrea, could you tell us a little bit about sort of how these conversations play out internally and within these associations? Because one of the things, you know, like there's obvious this effort in the United States is obviously part of a broader effort to reinforce gender binaries in the United States and to take other measures to restrict women's rights in the United States. So that's like it's part of that social context. But in the specific context of sport, you know, the positive spin that is sometimes put on efforts to regulate athletes who are not biologically confirmed as women according to some criteria from participating in women's sports is that's how to ensure a fair playing field once we accept that there should be that men and women should be competing in different competitions, basically. And so how does that sort of argument play out in contexts in which you have, on the other hand, competing claims like, well, those lines that are being used to police gender are arbitrary, not necessarily based on science, exclusionary, part of a further effort to insist that women are inferior, you know, so all of the problems that come with insisting on a stark binary in the way that Michele is expressing.
These are very complex issues. On the current situation, just a quick comment. I still have a big trust in courts in the United States. I'm licensed in 4 countries. As a lawyer, I have seen how the things develop. I still have a strong feeling that the cases and these orders will be challenged and they will be adjudicated based on rule of law, and the things will not necessarily be as bleak as today, as we are seeing them today. And I'm thinking that in this situation of certain uncertainty and chaos we are living legally here in the United States, I think we should be really looking towards international organizations, sports organizations. Although their rules and procedures and everything are not perfect, they are still providing certain kind of like a standard, global standard. On the question you are asking, gender binary athletes and all that stuff, what I saw, how that was regulated or how that people went around it, it started again from social and medical research. There were lots of discussions, there were framework agreements, papers, and everyone, different organizations internationally put forward their view on this. So there was a lot of debate before any kind of point was adopted. I was not directly involved in on this topic, you know, so I didn't work. I cannot really closely comment on it, but I think it will all play out at the end. We will see the competing interests, and again, to put forward our views on equality and opportunities for women. We need to again have a voice in these committees, in these legal committees of different sport organizations. And I again looked on the practical side, on the governance structures, and you know, we have for IOC, women commissions have 50% representations, but I was looking, there was governance, very good, excellent actually report by UK on governance and opportunities. It was published last year. And there, the leadership positions of women was still very weak. So for us lawyers, if we want to change and kind of put our voice forward and different perspective, we need to have a seat at the table and try to advocate on when those legal instruments, positions are framed, and not be afraid to say things. You know, I know when I was talking on the issues of safe sport, there was a conference at the prominent university. I had a very hard time getting prominent lawyers now who are big proponents of the safe sport to even come on the panel. So we just have to kind of, practically speaking, get into the dialogue and you know, provide the science. That's what you are doing at the academia on the prominent universities, and provide evidence why things should develop this for human rights and not against human rights.
Okay, great, thank you. I actually want to come back to you, Andrea, to ask about opportunities for expanding women in leadership in sports. But before we get to that issue, we can stick on this question for a bit. Lena, to ask you, what do you think is the most human rights protective position on this question of how to regulate female eligibility once one assumes, and then the question is, should one assume that there should be different competitive pools for male versus female sports? I mean, should the pools be differently orchestrated? Should we maintain like men's sports and women's sports? Should the eligibility, and if so, how should we think about defining eligibility in the most human rights protective way possible?
Yeah, so I think what is going on in the US with the recent executive degree and World Athletics rules are not the rules which are fostering human rights in the best way. I think they reinforce this idea that we can find a narrow definition of who's a woman, which is a very flawed idea on biological grounds. So I think that's important to start with. Then I think the IOC has provided a framework recently, a few years ago, on how to deal with issues of gender eligibility. And I do think that this framework provides a way forward because it really enshrines human rights into the debate. And it really also says that there cannot be a categorical exclusion of people on the basis of the gender identity or sex characteristics based on just the assumption that they have an unfair advantage in sports. So first of all, I think there's really a lack of any evidence which would justify the rules brought forward by World Athletics. So I think this framework which the IOC provided, I think is a good way forward, and it provides 10 steps which one can think about of how to come up with rules. I think one other thing to mention is that Carska-Sheppard, who has fought one set of rules used by World Athletics on the basis of which she was excluded from women's sports or would have needed to reduce her testosterone levels at the European Court of Human Rights, and she won her case at the chamber level, and now it's pending at the grand chamber level. So I think this let's see what the grand chamber is going to say about it. But I think the chamber decision already kind of shows that there need to be changes in the way how also athletes concerned have a seat on the table to talk about these issues and to have their views respected. Yeah.
So would you advocate for, given the difficulty of having an across the board rule and the problems with that approach, would you advocate for a individualized process for determining athlete eligibility, and therefore subjecting certain athletes to those who are all athletes, certain athletes, to more rigorous testing of, for example, certain hormone levels or whatever they might test, that kind of individualized process? Or do you think the process should be less medically focused and more sociologically focused? How might we do that, implement something in practice? I mean, I know they're difficult questions, but you've thought about these questions more thoroughly than many others have. So I'm just curious of your views.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So maybe just to come back to one question which you raised before, which I didn't respond to, which is whether to kind of get rid of the binary separation in sports as such then. And I would not personally advocate for that, because I think the results of that at the moment would be that certain women would drop out at the ranks of winners, but also maybe at the ranks of those people who just do sports. I think women-only sports are important and have kind of also increased the participation of women in certain sports areas. So I think I would be wary of the results which that would cause nowadays. Whether this in the future is a possibility, I think we can think about. And then I think regarding rules, coming back to the question of kind of then which rules should be applied, So I think like women with variations in sex characteristics have participated in sports throughout like history, and it has not caused an issue for women's sports as such. Women's sports are not jeopardized by the participation of women with variations in sex characteristics. I think there are many other kind of much more kind of prevalent issues in women's sports, such as the structural underfunding, such as sexual violence, such as the gender pay gap and so on, which are actually the core issues feminists and like women advocates should think about. Yeah, and I also think it's important to really think about the different forms of sports and level, the different forms of sports one can do, and also like that amateur sports and youth sports is very different than elite sports. And I think at the moment, what we can see is that these rules which actually govern elite sports, so international sport competitions, have a strong trickle-down effects to all of these other kind of sports areas, such as youth sports, such as amateur sports. And I think it's really a dangerous development.
Great, thank you. Michele, I'd like that is a nice lead into a question I'd like to ask you, which is a little bit of a version of a question I asked Lena earlier, which is like, what explains the attention that is paid to these issues now? And when we discussed the question earlier, the question I framed the question as, women have been fighting for better protections along a number of dimensions in sports for many years. Why now are issues relating to international law in sport and women in sport in particular getting so much attention? And we had a conversation about that, but focusing more specifically on this question, as Lena just mentions, there's so many issues confronting women in sports, and this is not, it seems not to be the most important or the most prevalent issue, but it is one that is super, super salient in certain circles. And is getting a lot of high profile attention, including by World Athletics itself. And so you can say, like, what explains that hyper attention on this issue, given all the other problems that women and issues that women confront in sports and that also need to be addressed? And given the attention that it is getting, does it need to be addressed in some way? And then is the way it's going to be addressed inherently going to be a problem, or is the best way to just say, like, look, it's getting a lot of attention, but it's not the most important issue, and we're just not going to really deal with it?
Yeah, it's a great question, because I definitely agree with Lena that it's an unfortunate distraction from many other important issues. I suppose it's one that that forces us to confront the really structural assumptions underpinning the sports system as a whole, this binary sex structure of sport, whereas all these other issues don't necessarily, although I would say they probably should get more to the structural issues, but the ways sport governing bodies and other organizations have found ways to address these without, totally unraveling the system as it exists. It's been easier to take sort of incremental steps, where this issue, I guess, gets right to the heart of the way the sports system is set up. It, of course, also touches on a point of a deep point of contestation in society and culture. It gets so much media coverage. There are different views around the world and different understandings of sex and gender around the world. So all those kind of conflicts really come to the surface with this issue. I don't think that means that we should ignore it, but it certainly is, it's very important, and it really deeply affects the number of people that it affects. It's a small minority group that it's affecting, which in one way makes it even more problematic. So it's really specifically targeting an already marginalized group of individuals. So it's important, but I agree that it is, in terms of the issues facing women's sport as a whole, this is not a major, not affecting the lives of most women in sport. And in terms of, addressing, I think the IOC framework that Lena mentioned is a positive development, but just to, offer some further context, those are their guidelines, and World Athletics' response, for example, to those guidelines was, yes, our rules align, and to the extent that they don't, it doesn't matter because we are the ones who have authority to make these rules. And invoke, to your earlier point, they always will invoke the justification of fairness in sport. So I think that is something that could be determined according to these sports organizations, only by them. They are the experts in their sport. And so what is fair is what they say is fair. So anytime you want to bring human rights law to the table to challenge these rules, they're, typical human rights analysis, it involves like, is there a legitimate justification, or are these, even if there is a violation of an individual's human rights, can it be justified based on some overriding justification, or is it proportionate to this justification? And we've seen, to the extent that courts have dealt with this, hasn't been dealt with a lot, but that usually they will take, World Athletics or whatever sport governing bodies assertion of fairness in sport to override the human rights concerns that have been raised. So that's like a sport specific challenge, I think, to bringing human rights into the conversation.
Okay, great. I see that Jen just popped back on. So she's telling us that we're almost done, but Andrea, I do want to get back to you before we wrap this up. And just to ask you the question briefly, if you don't mind. Okay, so one answer to the set of issues is to have better representation in the decision-making processes so that you have a broader range of voices, including the voices of those who are most affected by the decisions that are being made. So how do you think about enhancing the representation of women in leadership positions inside these organizations?
Yeah, so human rights, we have made a progress. There is still lots of work, but it's on the table, it's being discussed, it's in the courts. We are really focusing on it. So I'm feeling positive that we are going on the right direction. Again, as a corporate lawyer, I'm really not understanding why in top 100 athletes paid in the world, there is 0 women this year, like 2024. We have 0 compensation. We are seeing in corporate world, CEOs in the entertainment business, women represented everywhere. In C-suite, we have 10% women representation. So it's a human rights. I understand that corporate world is different than international organizations, but I think we need to really understand that it has to be on human rights level, but it has to be also on economical leadership level, place at the table, and really move on both sides. So we just have to really get the right people and sponsors and all strategies figured out how to do it and go on all directions. So I'm seeing the positive platform like this is great, but also to have like a professional sports represented at these kind of discussions would be interesting for me to see why we are seeing so few women in professional sports, which is going international. They are claiming they are going to expand international.
Okay, great. Well, thank you. We are out of time, but I want to say I've learned a lot from all of you, and I've really enjoyed this discussion, and I enjoy watching sports of all kinds and of all kinds of athletes. So I have a personal interest in this as well. And thank you so much to each of you for being here. And with that, I think I'll hand it over to Jen, who will tell us where to find this video for time immemorial.
Well, thank you everyone for joining us today. We will be sharing the recording of this conversation within the next week. That video and also the full archives of AJIl and AJIl Unbound can be found on the journal's website, which is cambridge.org/AJIL. And I just want to say thank you again to the panelists and to the audience all for your time. Goodbye.